As most of you are aware, I was recently asked how I maintain discipline in the face of skyrocketing metals prices. I was asked how I resist the temptation to go all in. I responded by laying out my current financial plan in a 6-part series. In that video series, I mentioned that I am entering Phase 2, which means stepping down from a highly demanding and stressful job and allowing my investments to supplement the income I am able to realize from a lower-paying line of work. I stressed the importance of predictable portfolio income during this phase, as well as the importance of predictable growth to make sure that Phase 3, or complete retirement, can become a reality. So the natural question many people asked was, for a person in Phase 1, how would you recommend they deploy their savings? This caused me to reflect a great deal. I was certainly much more aggressive during Phase 1 of my financial life. I spent a lot of time looking for strategies that could generate high levels of return. I spent countless hours studying asset valuation and placing myself into assets I thought would perform the best over a particular period of time. This resulted in me building up a substantial silver position over the decade of the 2000s, and then trading most of it for gold in the spring of 2011, just as an example. It worked out really well for me. In hindsight, though, it seems to me to have been more luck than skill. Had the rapid spike that resulted in me being able to exit my silver position at a gold-to-silver ratio in the low 30s not happened, then I'd be much further behind financially than I am now. So, if I had the decades of my 30s and 40s to live all over again, knowing what I know now, would I approach my finances the same way that I did? I'd have to say that the answer to that question is no. I have learned many things over the past few decades. I'm a lot wiser now than when I was 27 and just starting my chosen career. There are some things which worked for me that I would absolutely do again, and some things that worked for me that I would not do again. And so what I will offer those who are in their wealth accumulation phase is the benefit of what I know now to be true, as opposed to what I think could very well have been the result of luck rather than skill. There are a few general principles that are so powerful that if used will virtually guarantee success in a short period of time. These are: 1. Save a high fraction of your take-home pay. 2. Keep your expectations modest. 3. Avoid punishing mistakes. 4. Take advantage of opportunities to reduce taxes. And 5. Utilize asset protection techniques. This video is going to cover the first two, and maybe part of the third. I have become convinced that the single most important determinant of wealth accumulation is a person's saving rate. Most people I know focus on trying to achieve a high rate of return on their investments. I think this is the wrong approach, and I'll show you why. Let's consider a married couple who earns $50,000 per year after taxes. They have a total horizon from the time that they start working of 60 years, after which they will be dead. Of course, death is the ultimate retirement plan, but most of us would like to have some years of freedom from work ahead of the time of death. Hence, the need to save. This couple spends $45,000 per year. This means that they save $5,000 per year. They are aggressive in the investments that they choose and earn 8% per year after adjusting for price inflation. The blue curve shows how much they will have in their investments after a certain number of years of working. They know that once they retire, they are going to need to be more conservative with their investments, and so they will only be able to realize a 3% yearly return adjusted for inflation. The red curve shows how much they will need to have in their investment account, earning 3% per year, to be able to retire. I know this is rather simplistic in terms of the way that I'm looking at things, but it's realistic enough to make an important point. Notice that the blue curve and the red curve intersect a bit prior to 35 years. This means that our couple will need to work 35 years, saving 10%, earning 8% per year adjusted for inflation, in order to be financially free. By the way, this time estimate to financial freedom is independent of total earnings. It is only a function of the percent savings rate and the rate of return on investments. Keep the 35-year number in your heads for a moment. Let's consider what would happen with a higher savings rate and a more conservative investment approach. Our next couple also earns $50,000 per year after tax, but only spends $35,000 per year instead of $45,000. Because they are used to spending less, they won't need as much money saved up in order to be financially free. They take a much more conservative investment approach and only earn 4% per year adjusted for inflation as opposed to 8%. This is half the rate of return earned by the other couple. Again, the blue curve represents how much they will have saved at the end of each working year adjusted for inflation. The red curve represents how much they will need to consider themselves financially free. Although they have a significantly lower rate of return, they get to financial freedom by 28 years, which is a full 7 years earlier than the other couple. Why such a difference? It's because savings rate has a profound impact on the result. Not only does an increase in the savings rate increase the rate of wealth accumulation, but it also reduces the amount of resources needed down the road. Why doesn't investment return dominate? Well, when you think about it, the so-called miracle of compounding doesn't really have much of an impact until the later years of life when there are substantial assets. In the beginning, the rate of return doesn't matter much at all because there are only a few $1,000s generating that return. Towards the end of wealth accumulation, the rate of return is much more important. But then we have to stop and think about this. If the miracle of compounding doesn't make much of a difference until there are lots of assets accumulated, doesn't that also mean that seeking an aggressive rate of return towards the end requires substantial risk? What would happen if in the process of seeking a high return, our couple ends up with a very bad string of yearly results for a few years? That's right. Bye-bye to the notion of financial freedom. Now let's take a look at the combination of savings rate and investment return. I put together a table showing various combinations to see if we can draw some conclusions. Here is the table. Along the left, I have listed various savings rates from 0% of take-home pay all the way up to 50%. Along the top, I have listed rate of return during the wealth accumulation phase adjusted for inflation. Again, I'm assuming that once financial independence is reached, a more conservative 3% inflation adjusted rate of return is adopted. We can notice right away that for 0% savings, financial independence is achieved after 60 years, which is the point of death. Makes sense. A person who saves nothing will have to work until death if there are no social safety nets in play. We can also see that for rates of saving less than 10%, even with fairly high rates of return, a person will not be financially free for the majority of their adult lives. This represents what is typical. Most people don't save all that much, which means that their financial freedom won't happen until later in life, if at all. But then notice what happens when a person saves a third of their income or more. Even with a very conservative and modest return, that person can become financially free during the first half of their adult lives. Let me say that one more time so that it sinks in. If you save a third of your income or more the better, you can achieve financial freedom less than halfway through your adult life without taking any big risks. Of course, achieving a higher rate of return on investments will help you get there faster, but it is a secondary effect, not the primary effect. So, why did I put a negative column in this table? Who in their right mind would save their wealth in an asset that constantly goes down in value in real terms? And the reason will become clear in just a moment. Let's take the case of a person who has become convinced, probably as the result of bad advice from others, that a consistent 8% inflation-adjusted rate of return is reasonable. This person does the calculations and finds that he or she only needs to save 15% of their take-home pay and can then retire after working a career of 30 years. And that's what they do. All goes well for a while, and the person is quite pleased with his or her investment prowess. He or she even makes some YouTube videos teaching everyone else their secret. Then, just a couple of years before this person pulls the trigger on what would be an enjoyable and very long retirement, the value of their assets is marked down substantially. Now, instead of having an 8% rate of return, this person has a -2. This means that without a recovery in asset values, this person may have to work up to an additional 14 years. Wait, Belang P, I hear some people shouting. This realistically can never happen. Stocks have never lost money for longer than 15 years. Well, remember what I said about compounding not having much of an appreciable impact until the very end? Remember, Only a few $1,000s have been at work for the entire time period. The portfolio doesn't get very big until the very end of the savings horizon. And it's at that time that a big bear market can completely swamp a portfolio and thus change the dollar-weighted rate of return drastically. Besides, who said I'm talking specifically about stocks? This is just general math and can be applied to any asset or a group of assets. It can apply to dollar-denominated bank accounts during a monster inflation. It can apply to Bitcoin. It can apply to a person holding silver waiting for it to go to $500 per ounce. The important takeaway here is that by swinging for the fences, a person has less certainty over the outcome. The outcome of an investment policy is much more difficult to control than rate of savings. And this brings me to my final slide of the video. A person in the wealth accumulation phase can either expect a high rate of return or a low rate of return. And the result achieved will either be high or it will be low. The result achieved is partially the result of choices and partially the result of skill. However, without caution, the result can also be largely a matter of chance. If we look at all possible combinations, we see that a person who adopts a conservative assumption and saves heavily will either be satisfied with the results or pleasantly surprised, depending upon how well his or her assets perform. The savings rate does the heavy lifting, and so this person will be very robust to random moves in the market. The person who adopts aggressive assumptions will either be satisfied with the results or very disappointed. This person is likely not to be a heavy saver. Maybe the market will meet his or her expectations. If that's the case, great. If not, then there will be some years tacked on to the person's working adult life. So, my advice to people in the wealth accumulation phase is to be somewhat conservative and save heavily. This is what I know will work. As most of you are aware, I was recently asked how I maintain